this tour, what did you learn that surprised you?
Well, we've written a report on it. We're happy to let people access that report. We learned that there are some myths in people's minds about energy.
But you knew that, right? You knew people process
that. Right. But this confirmed how serious these myths are, such as we're running out of oil.
Right.
That's a huge myth that's out there. Another myth is that we actually control the prices of crude oil. When a company like Shell produces about 3% of the daily global production, it's a little hard to have an impact. And when you add up Exxon and Shell and BP and Chevron and Conoco and Total, you don't even get to 15% of daily production. So how in the world do these 5 companies or 6 companies control prices? Another myth is that there is a silver bullet just awaiting technical research, and that we'll find a silver bullet that will satisfy all of our energy needs. So those are the kind of myths.
Right.
But it also enabled us to put our views forward. And among those views is a 12-point plan that Shell has created for energy security for the U.S., and it actually would work around the world.
Let's hold off on that until a little later in our discussion, because I want our audience to be with us on some of the myths that you discovered and hope to debunk in your tour. Let's take, for example, the idea of scarcity. You talked about the peak oil thesis. Many of you in this room may be familiar with, certainly my students, I see a number of them in this room, the so-called Hubbard's peak of production. The geologist after whom it's named was actually at Shell Oil when he more or less correctly forecast the coming decline of the U.S. 48 states. Now many people who believe that thesis when expanded globally. Tell us why you think the idea that the world is running out of oil in any foreseeable future is not the right way to look at the problem.
Well, if we just start with the U.S., the scarcity of crude oil from the U.S. is purely public policy driven. Believe it or not, there's been a 30-year moratorium on East or West Coast drilling or Eastern Gulf of Mexico drilling. So for 30 years, the public policy of the land is don't drill here. Go somewhere else. That public policy was invented when the oil price was about $7 a barrel. That public policy was created shortly after the Santa Barbara blowout, which was a horrible thing, particularly for the residents of the west coast of California. But technology has moved on, and the oil price has moved on, and now it is a public absurdity to deny drilling to the nation that needs it most, which is the U.S.
So your argument is, as far as the U.S. is concerned, domestic resources, regulation is a major impediment of resources that exist.
For conventional oil and gas.
For conventional oil and gas.
So I haven't mentioned unconventional.
We'll talk about your investments in Shell in just a bit.
Peak was predicated on a set of narrow assumptions which never imagined deep water exploration. Never imagined this public policy constraining production. But it was predicated on what was known at the time in terms of the geophysics of the known world of oil back in the 50s. The fact that it happened to be correct was coincidental.
Sure.
And now we have the global issue where I believe we are still adding to the resource base of the world by new discoveries, new finds, new exploration. Shell just participated, for example, in a lease sale in the Chukchi Sea off the northwest coast of Alaska, or we just discovered a significant find in Brazil, which looks to be very, very, large. And Petrobras, we know, has made major discoveries off the coast of Brazil. So we're still adding to the known resource base. And to suggest that we are somehow peaking, I think we will only peak not because of shortage of oil, but because we'll prefer other forms of energy. And then therefore will not demand as much oil.
To press on this point just a little bit, if the regulations were removed or eased in the way that you advocate, is there enough oil on U.S. soil or offshore to eliminate the need for imports?
Probably not. Because let's put it in terms of numbers. The U.S. today produces something less than 7 million barrels, or around 7 million barrels a day. We consume 21.
We consume perhaps a quarter of the world's daily consumption of oil, almost half its gasoline.
Yeah, 21 million barrels against 85 million barrels. Now, just the 21 million barrels, just to put that in perspective, because I don't have a clue what 21 million of anything looks like. translating the 21 million barrels into actual, how much oil are we actually consuming? Think of it as 10,000 gallons a second. That's essentially a backyard swimming pool of oil consumed just in this country, which is 25% of the world's consumption every second.
Right.
Which means that it's 40,000 gallons a second worldwide. That's a lot of oil.
That's a lot of oil.
Backyard swimming pool every second of every minute.
Right.
And that's just oil. That's not counting coal. We can get onto coal later. But coal is even more prolific as an energy source than is oil.
What is the significance of the observation that even if we were to open up to drilling on WAR or other protected areas, all the areas that are under protection at the moment, that we would still need to import significant quantities of oil? Doesn't it argue for an interdependence model rather than an energy independence model?
Yeah, I think energy independence is a crock. It just makes no sense whatsoever. The world is interdependent. And to think that we somehow, as the United States of America, can declare energy independence is nothing but pandering for votes. And I've said that to many elected officials. So I'm not just saying it to unelected officials like yourselves. But here's the real issue, that we want interdependence because it's the check and balance on the global system. We want to have some voice in what happens elsewhere in the world. That's part of international trading, in my opinion. And we can bring our values, we bring our behaviors into an international trading system that maintains the integrity and the wholesomeness of it. But here's another aspect, and that is we could flip this oil price on its head. If the U.S. could put a plan together that says to the world, we're going to open access to more areas, and we're not saying 100% access, but when 85% of the outer continental shelf of the lower 48 is off limits, how about half of that? How about, let's...
But is that really true? Can we really drill our way to a solution? The DOE figures suggest that U.S. has less than 5% of the world's remaining reserves of conventional oil. The Persian Gulf has almost 2/3.
Think of the next 10 or 20 years. The 5% is a lot.
Right.
API reports 100 billion barrels. Take a long time to produce 100 billion barrels.
It's not the most economic oil either, right? It's cheaper in other parts of the world. If you argue,
cheaper than $100 a barrel.
Right.
I mean, all of that could be produced for probably less than $50 a barrel. All of the off-limits oil. And think about what it would say to the world trading system if America put a plan together to produce 3 million more barrels per day, taking our 7+ million barrels up to 10+ million barrels, over half of U.S. supply, and biofuel, and some of the other alternative fuels. We would say to the cartel, the OPEC cartel, we don't need you as much as we did before. And that would immediately take a lot of the speculation in futures markets down. It would ease the geopolitical tension, which is inflating the price as we speak. So the situation in Iraq, Iran, and other difficult countries, Venezuela, etc., it would take that tension off the table. And I would suggest, I don't predict oil price, but I would suggest that just the announcement itself would have a huge impact on speculation.
Let's pick up on that point, because that points a little bit to the second myth that you wanted to challenge. The idea that the private sector oil companies like yours and the other branded companies people often talk about as big oil, that you set prices or that you're price manipulators. You rightly pointed out that the private sector oil companies actually add up to a minority share of the world's reserves. Something perhaps some people may not realize in the audience, but the lion's share is one of the only large industries on earth where the cheapest and best and largest reserves are in the hands of governments, not in the efficient private sector producers. And the OPEC cartel acts much more like a price setter, and private oil companies are essentially price takers. This dynamic, though, you talked about over the next 10 to 20 years, the role of non-OPEC oil, whether it's here in the U.S. or other places. As we see OPEC oil become more important in world markets, the Saudis have an enormous amount, about a quarter of the world's proven reserves left. The oils are very cheap. I believe that the argument made by experts, internal and outside the U.S., is unless the world moves away decisively from oil, that we will see Saudi market share, Middle East share increase, absent other kinds of interventions. In that context, do you think it will be oil from the United States, which might be more expensive, have environmental complications, be politically sensitive, or will it be alternatives, biofuels, hydrogen, electricity, efficiency? There's a whole panoply of things the U.S. can embrace. Is domestic, relatively expensive oil really a runner when comparing this horse race of alternatives?
I think it is, and I think the answer will be a multiplicity of sources of energy, including somewhat more expensive American-produced oil. Keep in mind that there are, in existing oil reservoirs, generally about a third of the oil in the ground is produced, leaving 2/3 or at least half of the oil in the ground, where technology can be a game changer for enhanced oil recovery. So if this nation put a plan together for a comprehensive national energy security strategy that dealt simultaneously with the supply side of unconventional or conventional oil, technology to produce more oil, clean coal, etc., and also dealt with the demand side with increased efficiency, increased use of clean energy or alternative forms of energy, and dealt with the CO2 issue, so that we could perhaps capture and sequester CO2 as a supercritical liquid in the ground. That could enhance oil recovery in many abandoned or existing fields that would further produce more domestic oil at a fairly reasonable cost. It's Shell's view, and my view as well. And so you could put this whole combination of factors to work, to where the U.S. could, not in a sense of becoming energy independent, but in the sense of having more affordable energy. Because I think that should be the goal. It should be more affordable energy and cleaner energy for the good of the society and the good of the world. I think we can have all of that. And the Saudis will need to be producing oil for years and years to come, because there are countries like China and India and other developing nations that don't have hydrocarbons in quantities that could sustain economic growth. So there will continue to be a market for that oil, and it will continue to probably be fairly expensive. That cost of that crude, which we're today importing, may stay about the same, but it frees up this country to pursue many other alternatives that would be affordable at somewhere between $50 and $100 a barrel. Let's face it, alternative energy, folks, is not yet cheap. Wind farms, solar energy, hydrogen, coal gasification, these are not cheap.
Talk just for a moment on unconventional oil, and it's just to define for those in the audience who may not be familiar. When we talk about unconventional oil, we're talking about things like Canada's tar sands, which can be converted into gasoline, but usually with more energy input, usually more expensive processes, and more environmental damage with a bigger carbon footprint. And your own company has a presence in Alberta, Canada, but you also have investments in shale in the American West. Can you tell us a little bit about how the economics of those have changed as the oil price has gone up? It used to be, $50, $60 a barrel or more. It would be very, very expensive to do shale out in the West. How's the economics changing?
Well, just stay with the oil sands for a
Sure.
moment. The oil sands require upgrading of, this is just really tar sands, sticky tar mixed with sand, which you mine with trucks and shovels, and then you use steam or another heat source to separate the molecules of oil from the sand. Clean up the sand and you put it back in the earth. You take the oil, which is heavy oil, which takes more upgrading in a refinery, and then you can ultimately create refined products. That whole combination is more expensive than conventional oil and conventional oil refining. But the price has been hugely inflated because of the location and the demand for this product quickly. And so there's no people that live in northern Alberta. So we have to bring all the people in. We have to bring all the equipment in. And world mining is booming. And so the cost of equipment has gone up for, huge inflation in equipment. The availability of natural gas as an energy source has become more expensive for the upgrading processes. So all of these cumulative costs have made oil sands more expensive than we predicted, say, even 5 years ago. And it's likely to stay high.
But they're economic, clearly, at today's prices.
But at today's prices, it's economic. The oil shale is a whole other matter. Oil shale is solid rock.
Right.
There's a kerogen within rock that is solid. And you may remember the Syncrude projects in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where the technology was to mine the rock with big quarry pits and trucks, and then to crush the rock and then heat it in retort mechanisms till the molecules came out. Shell's been out there for 20 years developing an in situ technology,
right,
where we put heaters into the ground. We heat the ground, the molecules separate under the ground, there's no mining, there's just drilling.
Right.
And then we pump out liquid molecules and gaseous molecules, and it's semi-refined before it hits the earth.
Now, there's no question that technological innovation involved in unconventional hydrocarbons has been extraordinary. The dollars going into it are great, and the resource base is vast. Just Alberta, it is estimated, has more energy potential than perhaps Saudi Arabia's oil. It's enormous, and there's no discovery risk. We know where it is. But isn't one of the big questions carbon? If there were to be a significant carbon price through cap and trade or anything else, these energy-intensive ways of making gasoline or other fuels would be priced out of the market or banned out of existence.
Of course, in that process, you would consider offsets to the high use of carbon.
So you'd plant rainforests in Bolivia to offset.
Yes, so you could do reforestation, you could
Right.
do wind and solar and other alternative energy forms.
Will that fly politically, do you think?
I think only if you educate the elected officials who make the laws.
Right.
And we suffer from that currently. Because again, the oil industry, I don't blame elected officials, folks, and I don't blame the American public for their lack of knowledge and information about oil and gas or energy. I blame energy companies, including my own, for not having embarked upon public education, forever. Pharmaceuticals do it better. Chemical companies do it better. For some reason, oil and gas companies have just shied away from the public, hoping for good public policy, praying for it, basically, but not educating. Because this whole notion that our profits are obscene is really a failure of public education.
The pharma has long had much higher profit margins, but a better
medium profitability industry.
Right.
And it's 7.5% to 8% return on sales. And the numbers are big because our volumes are huge. But the reality is that there are better investments for your money in terms of return on sales than the oil industry. But over the long haul, you can get a very good dividend from oil companies usually.
I want to be sure to attend to the question from one of the gentlemen about U.S. foreign policy, the link between policies here at home on energy and overseas foreign policy. And to put it very bluntly, isn't a lot of the trouble we're involved with in the Middle East because of our oil policies?
Well, all across the country we heard this from Americans all across the country. What is the true cost of oil per barrel? Don't you have to include the cost of the Iraq War? Mm-hmm. So we got those questions. I do think that because U.S. public policy has been so flawed, the United States has added to international tension by having such a heavy dependence on imports. And the need for those imports that come from sometimes some pretty unsavory locations has contributed to geopolitical tension. Whether that's deliberate or whether that's an outcome of just not wanting to produce, not having a deliberate international strategy to do that, but just avoiding our domestic problem of trying to produce more oil. The consequence is we contribute to geopolitical tension. However you might want to describe the recent history in Venezuela, and Chavez is removed for a day or two and then he's back in power, blames the U.S. Whether that's true or not, I have no way of knowing. But the consequences of it are devastating on the geopolitical tension. Venezuela oil production is slipping by the year because of this hostility towards Western companies and Western nations, such as the United States. So yeah, there has to be a connection, but whether it's deliberate or whether it is by neglect, I don't know.